Hello, welcome back. Why did the crab not cross the road? Because it could only use the sidewalk. Okay, let's get to it. So, today's topic, we are doing a little bit of revision. One second. Here we go. So, we are talking about simultaneous equations. In particular, it's not quite simultaneous yet, but we're talking about linear models because this is going to be one part of your simultaneous. So you'll need to understand linear models quite well. And essentially, it's just going to be an application of your linear relationships, which means it's y equals mx plus c, but now y, m, x, and c, they all represent real or like real values or real variables. So instead of y and x, it might be cost and time, or it might be hours and distance. It could be all these different things. Um, Now, how do we break down questions like this? The most important part with any linear relationship is going to be your gradient and your y-intercept. Okay, now we need to break this down into the real world language. And so whenever you hear the word per or you're given some sort of rate, that is an indication that we're talking about your gradient or we're talking about your m. Okay. And then they'll also talk about this other thing. They'll sometimes call it a fixed cost. They'll call it flag fall. They'll call it startup or a booking fee. Um, that there, and if you don't know what a flag fall is, long story short, flag fall is if I hire a taxi, it's kind of like the booking fee. Okay, if I talk about a startup, that means how much money I need to begin a business or something. It means without having produced anything, I still need to pay that price. Same thing with a booking fee. I will need to pay a booking fee no matter how long I book for. I have to pay that booking fee. We often call that a fixed cost. That there is kind of going to be your y-intercept. Okay. So it means that even when, I'll show you on the graph later, but these things generally represent your y-intercept. Okay. Flag fall, startup, booking fee, fixed cost, anything that you have to pay or anything that is already a value before you even start, that there is your fixed cost. Okay. And so I will give you an example of, I guess, how a question like this may work. And I'm going to try to highlight key pieces of information here. So let's take a look. We've got, it says a hat factory has a fixed cost of $450 per day and a cost of $5 per hat produced. Okay, so what we need to kind of break down here is we need an equation, and because this is going to be, I know it's going to be some sort of version of y equals mx plus c. Okay, but what I need to do is, it says here that there is a fixed cost of 450. That's my hint that that's going to be my y-intercept. So it's going to be, 450, sorry. So that means to book this factory, no matter, even if I make nothing, the booking itself, having the factory, I guess, open is going to cost me $450, whether I make anything or not. That's my fixed cost. And it also says here that there's a cost of $5 per hat produced. And so this one here, because it's not the fixed cost, $5 per hat, that's going to give me a little hint that that's going to do with my gradient. Okay. So that means my gradient in this particular case is going to be 5. Now, how do I write an equation representing this? Also, y and x don't make the most sense for this. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I want to represent the cost. And so cost, I'm going to represent as y, and I'm going to write all this down. Y is going to represent the number, or like the total cost, and x is going to represent the thing that I'm producing, which in this case is the number of hats. Okay. And so now if I want to rewrite this equation, and I'll write it in blue so it doesn't look so boring. What I want to do is I want to find the cost. It's going to be 5 times the number of hats that I sell. So in this case here, I'll say 5h for number of hats. And then I just need to, whatever that is, I need to plus 450 because that is my y-intercept. Okay, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. But this here is going to become my, I guess, my baseline equation that I would work all the rest of my questions off. Okay, and I'm hoping it makes sense. It's $5 per hat plus the 450 that I need to, it's the fixed cost. Okay, so that's your y-intercept. 450 is your y-intercept, 5 is your gradient. And then what you're finding is you're finding the total cost it would be. Okay, so how would you use this? The questions may go from this to being find the cost of producing 5,000 hats. So in other words, that's a fancy way of saying H will equal to 5,000. And I want to find the cost, so it's find C. So in other words, C is going to equal to 5 times H, which in this case is 5,000. And it's going to be plus 450. And I'm going to have to do this in my head because I've left my calculator. That's going to be 25,450. And that's going to be how much it would cost to produce these 5,000 hats. Okay. That there is that. Okay, so you can see for this part here, once you've got the equation, the hard part is always forming that equation up there. After that, it's just going to be substitute and solve. And let me show you what I mean. Now, this one here is now for part 2. I want to find the number of hats that I can produce with $1,000. So that means here, my total cost I have here is $1,000. And if I want to find the number of hats, I'm solving for H. So now I just substitute and solve. So 1,000 would equal to 5 times H plus 450. Okay, so see, this time we know we know the cost, but I don't know the number of hats. So here you would just solve backwards as you normally would with equations. I'd minus 450 to both sides. So that gives me 550 on this side, 5H, divide both sides by 5. That is 110. So that means if I had $1,000 with this particular factory, I can produce 110 hats with $1,000. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense. And then the last thing that they may ask you to do, because these are linear relationships, we'll need to be able to sketch. Okay, so again, I'm going to write down the formula that we worked with. It was C equals 5H plus 450. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to actually map this on here. And we need to pick, I guess, what we call a suitable scale. Now, this one here, I can see that it was, let's see, 110 hats was made with $1,000. So let's use a fairly big scale. I'm going to go with roughly, it's not going to be perfect, but we're going to do it anyway. So 500, 1,000, whoops, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. That there is going to be my cost. And then down here will be the number of things that I will produce. And so in this case here, it looks like a good scale might be something like 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. Okay. Sometimes you will have to pick your own appropriate scale, and you will need to label that's for hats, that's for cost. And for here, we already know 1 point for sure. We know that when we make with $1,000, we can make 110 hats. So 1,000, 110, I'm going to say is approximately there. That's 1 point. I also know another point, which I know that my fixed cost was $450, which means even if I make no hats, I'm going to have to still pay $450. And so that's going to be roughly there. And so here I've already got 2 points. 2 points is generally enough to draw a line. I would always do 3 just to make sure. But here, this would be an example of your graph. Now, again, this is a sketch, so it's not going to be perfect. But that will give you a general idea of, and this would be a general idea of a sketch of, yeah, what represents the cost of all these making hats. Hopefully that makes sense, and I will catch you guys in the next one. See you guys later. Bye. My bad. There's one more part here. The other type of question is, instead of going from an equation to a graph, is they will give you a graph, and they'll ask you to change it back into an equation. Okay. So here's an example of a graph. I'm going to read the question and then I'll scroll back up. But it says here the graph represents the cost of hiring an electric scooter based on the number of kilometers traveled. Okay, now find the initial booking fee, find the rate of hire, and then write an equation for the cost of hire. Okay, so the initial booking fee, that there's a big hint. That's your key terminology. That's talking about a y-intercept. And where is your y-intercept on your graph? It's right where it cuts the y-axis. And here you can see the y-intercept is $20. So there you go. That's $20. That's part one done. Now find the rate of hire. Okay, now generally when you see the word rate, or you see something dash something, that's a hint that it's a rate. This here is talking about your gradient. And I hope you guys remember gradient is the same thing as rise over run. Okay, so if I'm trying to find the gradient of this, what I would do is I would find 2 points here that I can kind of see. Now, I can pick a lot of 2 different points, but I'm going to try pick 2 points that will line up quite nicely with my grid. Okay, so I can see here, this point here is nice, this point here is nice. And I'm going to make a right angled triangle so I can find my vertical rise and my horizontal run. Okay, so for this particular one here, if I talk about my rise over run, I can see here that my rise is, I go from 20 to 30, so that's a rise of 10. And then if I look at my run goes from, and again, because I'm looking horizontally, it goes from 0 to 4. So 0 to 4 would be a total run of 4. And I can see here, this would be 2.5. Oops. Stick with me, guys. Yeah, which equals to 2.5. Okay. So you can write it as 10 on 4. You can write it as 5 on 2. It doesn't matter as long as you've got the general idea. Now, with that in mind, that would be, if it's 2.5, and I'll keep it as 2.5 because I think that makes more sense for this question rather than 5 on 2 because it's asking for the rate of hire. Essentially what this is saying is this is $2.50 per kilometer. Okay, so there's your gradient. That's that answered. Now the last part here is find an equation for the cost of hire. Okay, so equation, that's kind of your hint that it's y equals mx plus c because it's a straight line. All we have to do now is figure out what kind of each thing, what your variables are. So I can see here that cost, I'm just going to label that as C. My number of kilometers, I'm going to talk about that as maybe distance. And then we also know that your initial booking fee, that's your C, your plus C. Okay, so I know this is going to get a little bit confusing because we're talking about 2 different C's, but let me try to make sense of it. The way that I would find the cost is I would find the gradient, which I found was $2.50, times your distance, plus your y-intercept, which we said here was 20. And that there would be how you'd find an equation for the cost of hire. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense, and I'll catch you guys in the next one for reals this time. See you later. Bye.